Democratic primary. It's co-hosted by The Appeal and Now This. I'm Jay Willis, your host for today, senior contributor at The Appeal. And I'm really excited to welcome our guests to this forum. But first, let's talk a little bit about the district. New York 16 includes part of the Bronx and then part of Westchester County to the north. The incumbent is Democrat Eliot Engel, who has represented the district for 32 years. He's currently the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he is running for a 17th term this year. All four candidates in this race have been invited to join this virtual forum, and here today with us are Jamal Bowman, principal at a Bronx middle school, who's been a teacher and a public school advocate for 20 years. Also joining us is Chris Fink, a tax attorney who has worked in the municipal and energy sectors for about 2 decades, and Sammy Ravello, a US Navy veteran, who after completing his service joined the NYPD, where he served for 25 years and retired as a lieutenant in 2018. Congressman Engel, the incumbent, was invited to participate, but did not respond to our invitation. Candidates, welcome. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, let's go over a couple quick ground rules, format type of thing. We'll start with opening statements before moving on to a question and answer session. Each of you will have 2 minutes for those opening statements, and then a minute for a quick closing statement at the end. We've picked randomly to determine the order in which candidates will deliver those opening statements, so please stay tuned for those prompts. As I mentioned before the show started, I will give each of you 90 seconds to respond. Please don't make me cut you off, because I will do it if I have to, but then I'll feel bad about it for the rest of the day, and I really don't want that in my life. With that said, I will kick it to Mr. Bowman for a 2-minute opening statement. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for putting this forum together. My name is Jamal Bowman, running for Congress in the 16th District of New York. For the last 20 years, I've worked in public education. Started my career as an elementary school teacher in the South Bronx before serving as a dean of students at the High School for Arts and Technology. And for the last 10.5 years, I've served as a middle school principal at the Cornerstone Academy for Social Action Middle School. After working in education for 8 years and realizing how underfunded and under-resourced our schools were, and realizing that we had a criminalization apparatus within our school system, I decided to do something about it. As a matter of fact, in 2008, while serving as the dean of students, my job was to monitor the metal detectors, and I felt more like a corrections officer than an educator. So we organized parents, teachers, and students to brainstorm ideas for a new revolutionary middle school that we would open in the Bronx. We wrote the proposal, submitted it to the city, and in 2009, Casa Middle School was born. I served there for 10 years as a community school, providing resources to the families, not just of our school, but to the extended community. We partnered with Montefiore Medical Center to build a healthcare facility attachment to the school, and we organized with parents throughout the state to push for better education policy. I'm running for Congress because I got sick and tired of our kids suffering from poverty and trauma at the hands of bad policy, and Eliot Engel not being a leader on any of the real issues that matter most, like housing, healthcare, education, and jobs. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for your support, and I look forward to this as we move forward.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir. Mr. Fink, I'll go to you next.
Thank you, Jay. My name is Chris Fink, and I'm running for Congress for a number of reasons. We need new leadership. Leadership's in a lot of areas, but first, we need to address our crumbling infrastructure. We need to address strongly the climate crisis in our country and in our world. We need to end systemic racism in our district. And finally, I have a plan to get us back to work safely after this pandemic. I've lived in our district for 28 years. I grew up in New York. I'm son of a union lineman from Con Edison who spent his career keeping the lights on in the Bronx. I went through public school my whole career from kindergarten through law school, and my kids followed in my footsteps. And after law school, I've spent the last 34 years, both as a lawyer and a municipal advisor, advising state and local governments on infrastructure and renewable energy projects. Now is the time to fix our crumbling infrastructure in our district. Now is the opportunity to address climate change and become a leader in the world again. I have a plan called my See Forward plan, which is on my website, which addresses the social challenges, the environmental opportunities, and economic recovery, which is going to be badly needed after this pandemic is over. I have practical and pragmatic solutions. As I've told people as I was preparing for this run, there's really three things that your representative can represent you on: international issues, national issues, and local issues. And I feel like our district has not been represented locally or nationally for a number of years. And that's what I plan to do. I'm ready to roll up my sleeves and get to work for you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Ravello, go ahead.
Thank you, Jay. I am Sammy Ravello. I am an immigrant, war veteran, and retired police officer that spent 26 years working and protecting the families and community in the Bronx. It is time to bring new leadership to our district, someone who understands the needs of the community. I will fight for education, housing, and jobs. This country needs to heal from the division it is in. There is an opportunity to elect someone who understands the complex issue of now police brutality and racism. As an Afro-Latino man, I understand these issues both from the community perspective and from the law enforcement perspective. I have been endorsed by 30 individuals and organizations like the Veterans Chamber of Commerce and the Latinos Board. Yo soy Sammy Ravelo, soy un inmigrante veterano de guerra, policía retirado que trabajó por 26 años con la comunidad. Es tiempo de elegir a líderes que entiendan y luchen por educación, viviendas y trabajos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, sir. So moving to our question and answer section, I want to talk a little bit about what's been, the biggest story in the country for weeks now. Police kill Black and brown people every week in this country. About half of police killings involve someone living with a mental illness or disability. And these latest killings in a long history of police brutality, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, have inspired protests and uprising across the country. And it's coming at a really unique moment, right? As cities and states are slashing their budgets for services across the board: housing, education, healthcare, even things like waste collection during this pandemic. And yet you're seeing police budgets remain essentially untouched, or in some cities, they're actually growing. So elected officials across the country are hearing, and in some cases responding to these cries to defund the police. So I'll ask Mr. Fink first. What is your position on sort of realigning public safety budgets by shifting resources away from what we might call traditional law enforcement and investing in more public health-based and community-led public safety programs and solutions?
Jay, I think you've asked an excellent question among the three of us, because I think we're at three different spots on the spectrum. But my view is I am completely against the concept of defunding the police. I think the concept should be more to reallocation of funds that are currently allocated to the police. So demilitarize the police. The police, as Representative Clyburn stated this week, police have a function in our society. We need police officers, but we need them to provide services that are not military in nature. New York State, we have 2 armored vehicles held by the police force. I don't understand why we need those. We have AR-15s that police officers are given. I don't understand why we need those. We need to reallocate that money that's currently allocated to the police force and provide better training, better testing, and socialized policing. It just, the defunding concept makes no sense whatsoever, because we do need police officers in our country. They serve a role, and we need to make sure the training fits that role.
Thanks. Mr. Ravello, same question to you.
There you go. There you go. Well, as a former police officer, obviously, it's false when you hear an elected official or a candidate calling for defunding the police. That's not really going to happen. And I hate when they use these terms, because in reality, what they're talking about is what Chris just said, they're going to shift some of the roles that police have. I've been the only one that has held the role as a police officer. I'm going to start by saying that I'm very proud of my service. I'm very proud of a lot of my friends that served in the police department. I went 26 years in the NYPD, never got a civilian complaint, and I was involved in over 20,000 arrests. So I know policing and how policing is. There's two things that we pretty much need to change. It's transparency in hiring, and we have to change the culture. You get to those two things, and we're going to solve some of the issues. Training is essential. We have police officers in the role, and I had my police officers in the role of having to deal with people that had mental issues, and they weren't prepared for that. And that goes a long way. Also, we got to make sure that police officers are put in a role that they understand the community that they're serving. And I've often found myself training cops that should have been trained in the police academy, letting them know how the community is. Me being from the community, from the Bronx, letting them know, listen, this is what they do. So we get police officers from somewhere else, grew up with somewhere else, didn't know the culture, and that can get them into trouble. But policing is essential because the same people that we want to protect, we want to make sure that they remain protected once we scale down some of the uses that we have the police officers. I believe that shifting some of that money into health programs, mental health programs and education, which is huge, I think goes a long way. Education is a big issue in our community, especially in the brown and black community, and I'd like to have more money spent on that.
Thanks. Mr. Bowman.
Yeah, so, I've been a black man in America my entire life, and I've experienced a lifetime of police harassment and police brutality. The first time I was beaten by the police, I was 11 years old, horseplaying with my friends, making a little bit too much noise. The police were upset by this and decided to throw me against the wall, handcuff me, and scrape my face all across the ground, and left me with bruises. And my mother and I felt we had no recourse in terms of what to do about it because we felt powerless against the state and against the police that represented the state. And this has been a lifetime of personal interactions with the police, and also interactions based on my students and the families that I've served throughout my career. So I support defunding the police and reallocating those resources towards mental health supports, hiring more teachers, hiring more nurses, job training programs, etc. Because right now, the police mostly occupy communities of color, low-income communities, and what we're doing is we're criminalizing the poor as opposed to reinvesting in communities that have been neglected for decades. We also need more transparency and more accountability, which is why we are for and supportive of ending qualified immunity at the federal level, as well as the repeal of 50A here at the state level. And we released a reconstruction agenda that goes at the issue of not just police brutality and police reform, but also institutional racism in all its forms throughout this country.
Thanks. So I want to step back a little bit from the defunding the police topic and talk a little bit about the Justice in Policing Act, which has been proposed by members of the Congressional Black Caucus and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. It would ban chokeholds, establish a national database to document police misconduct, and make it easier to hold police officers criminally and civilly accountable for misconduct. If you were elected, Mr. Ravello, would you support this bill?
Well, I haven't read the entire bill. I know that in the NYPD, chokeholds are prohibited. I would like to see the bill to see what exactly it says. So I'm not ready to say, that I would vote for the bill. I do agree that if a police officer if there is a federal law banning chokeholds, it was banned in the NYPD a long time ago. I absolutely. I'd like to read the bill first before I answer that one.
Thank you. Mr. Bowman, would you vote for the bill?
Yes, I would support this bill, but the bill doesn't go far enough. Again, it doesn't include ending qualified immunity. It doesn't include conversations around demilitarization of the police. It doesn't include anything related to the transfer of military arms from the federal government to local police department. And it doesn't include what we're talking about in our Reconstruction agenda around truth and reconciliation, around lowering not just police resources, but the overly bloated budget of our military budget as well. So there are many things it doesn't include. There are many things we have to continue to push for, higher standards for police, how we recruit and train and retain police, and racial bias. And also, as I mentioned before, reinvesting and investing massively in public health and social programs, including housing, mental health, jobs, etc.
Great. I want to make sure I understand. So while it's your contention that it doesn't go far enough, you wouldn't withhold your support of the bill over that. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Fink.
I too would support the bill, and I too would want to add things to it. For example, I would require the use of hate crime legislation be used when prosecuting officers target people of color. I would also implement a standard that's been in the law for many years about reasonable and necessary when using force. Very straightforward. Same thing, I'd require de-escalation and de-escalation training and techniques prior to use of force. I'd also add a three strikes legislation. Officer Chauvin, the racist who was arrested in Minneapolis, had 18 prior complaints against him. 18. That should never happen. After 3 prior complaints, I think it should go to an outside board for review outside the police department to make sure that this person is suitable to serve in this very important role. I'd ban chokeholds, obviously. Other countries have done that. It makes no sense. But again, I come back to the reasonable and necessary standard. In all of the cases that we've seen of late, the force used was not reasonable and necessary. I understand, and I agree with Sammy that there are situations that I've not been in, but I can see situations where you would need to use force if the person you were arresting stronger, possibly on drugs. But I think that you need standards before you do so, and you should require de-escalation. I think police forces should have more education on de-escalation techniques. And finally, I think there has to be much more training on using the proper techniques for people with mental illness. Thank you.
So turning to another police accountability, issue that's been in the headlines lately, I want to talk about no-knock warrants. So on March 13th, in the middle of the night, Louisville, Kentucky police executed one of these no-knock warrants and entered the apartment of 26-year-old Breonna Taylor, a Black woman. They opened fire, hit her at least 8 times, killing her. Police found nothing illegal in her home, and in fact, the person they were searching for was somewhere else and was already in custody. And the tactics they used in that raid, a battering ram, the element of surprise, those are used by police departments all over the country. And as we've seen, the results can be disastrous. So a week ago, on June 11th, the Louisville Metro Council unanimously voted, all 26 members, to ban the department from using no-knock warrants in response to the killing of Ms. Taylor. And we see the sentiment reflected, it's the sentiment of many Americans too. Polling conducted by the Justice Collaborative Institute and Data for Progress shows that a majority of voters want to strictly regulate or even eliminate no-knock raids altogether. So Mr. Bowman, I'll ask you, do you believe that the Department of Justice should condition receipt of local law enforcement grants on cities and other jurisdictions banning these no-knock warrants?
Yes, absolutely, 100%. Breonna Taylor was the latest example. There have been many examples over the last several years. I'm forgetting her name, but the young 8-year-old girl in Chicago, I believe, or it might have been Detroit a few years back, was also killed as a result of a no-knock warrant, police coming in and shooting. Yes, I believe financial assistance should be conditioned based on states banning the use of no-knock warrants. Absolutely.
Thank you. Mr. Fink, same question.
Yes, I completely agree. I think it goes back to the discussion we had earlier about reasonable and necessary. The amount of force and the techniques that are used in no-knock warrants are generally not, in fact, it's hard to think of a case where they are warranted. In cases like this, where they had a house that they were watching, they could wait until sunlight or to a point where they could determine whether there's reasonable need for force of that nature. It goes back to another concept in law of use of deadly force can only be used if you're in fear of imminent bodily harm. There was no imminent bodily harm to these officers that used the no-knock warrant and killed Breonna Taylor. So I would be absolutely in favor of it.
Thank you. Same question, Mr. Ravello.
No, I disagree. The no-knock warrants have their use. I was an undercover police officer in the New York City Police Department, undercover detective for 4 years. I was in narcotics for 5. They have their use. I think that we should limit them. But folks, at the end of the day, and I don't know where, Jamal Bowman is going to, I don't know how he's going to protect the citizens that he's going to serve here in this district. But, this entire notion that now all of a sudden we just going to render the police powerless is nonsense. It's nonsense, the complete nonsense. It has its use. What happens is that the people, the culture needs to change. But we, at the end of the day, we have to protect our citizens. There are bad people out there, believe it or not, and I worked in all minority communities, people like me that look like me, an Afro-Latino man. And there are bad people. So we got to make sure that the people that are preying on people that look like me. So we got to make sure that those people are protected. No-knock warrants have its use. We have judges that sign them. We just have to make sure that we limit them. But at the end of the day, there are bad people. And we need to have the power to protect our most vulnerable citizens.
So as you've alluded to, Mr. Ravello, there's pretty wide gap between banning no-knock warrants and the status quo. And you've mentioned this need to limit them.
Right.
So if you're not for the ban, can you tell me a little bit about what limitations you would like to see?
Well, for example, I'll give you a perfect example, and it's a case-by-case basis. Remember, nothing is if you have you're searching for a subject on a warrant for narcotics, let's say, and there is no firearm involved, there's no violence involved in this subject, I would not be inclined to give a no-knock warrant for that. Like I said, we have to go on a case-by-case basis. Is the subject a person that has been preying on our citizens? I have to make sure that there has to be a criteria, the history of the felon, the type of warrant that we're trying to execute, and at the same time, is there any violence behind this? So I can't give you a specific, this no good, but there's got to be a little leeway. We can't just say we're going to ban this all outright and then leave our citizens exposed to harm from some people that prey on our citizens. There's just a fact. People prey on our citizens, and we got to make sure that we protect them.
Thanks. I want to move on to talking a little bit about the federal response to the COVID-19 pandemic and how each of you would respond to that. So as you're probably aware, since mid-March, more than 40 million Americans have filed for unemployment benefits. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, who serves as the co-chair for the Congressional Progressive Caucus, put it this way: mass employment is a policy choice, and we must choose differently by passing an urgent proposal that matches the scale of this crisis. So when we talk about what that solution would look like, hers is called the Paycheck Recovery Act. It would provide grants from the government to fully cover worker wages up to $90,000 and also cover their benefits. It would also be retroactive to March 1st, so it would cover employees who have been laid off or furloughed. And this isn't really a partisan thing. You're also seeing even conservative Republicans like Missouri Senator Josh Hawley gather support for their own paycheck protection bill while calling Democrats, and I quote, the party of unemployment. So my question for you, Mr. Ravello, is if you were to represent this district, would you support that Paycheck Recovery Act I just outlined?
Yes, 100%. 100%. Our people are suffering out here, as they start opening up the economy, you can see the effects. I mean, there were before I'm pretty sure all three of us could agree, before the pandemic, people were starting to suffer. You go around Central Park Avenue in Yonkers, a lot of stores were being closed. So I absolutely support that proposal, and I hope it passes.
Thanks. Mr. Bowman, how about you?
Yes, it is a proposal that I supported. We called from the very beginning for a cancellation of rent, cancellation of mom and pop mortgages, and the cancellation of utilities, as well as $2,000 per month to anyone who lost their job throughout the duration of the pandemic, including undocumented immigrants as well. We called for that very aggressively at the very beginning. As you mentioned, COVID hit the entire country hard. It hit this district incredibly hard with the second case in the state, I believe, in New Rochelle. The New Rochelle response was excellent. Within 8 days, we contained an area. We brought in the National Guard to help distribute food. We had a testing site, but the response was inequitable and unequal. When you look at it taking another 23 days to get to Co-op City in terms of a testing site, and another 53 days for a testing site to get to Yonkers, Mount Vernon, and NYCHA developments. So definitely support it, and we called for even additional resources from the federal government.
Thanks. I'm actually going to return to some of those recurring payment proposals later. But for now, Mr. Fink, same question.
Yes, Jay. As you mentioned, the federal government's response to the COVID crisis was that they were woefully unprepared for this crisis. They were unprepared from a health perspective. They were unprepared from a planning perspective. So that's why I came up with the plan that I alluded to in my open statements, the See Forward plan, which addresses the social challenge, the environmental opportunities, and the economics that we need to come out of this crisis. We need a plan to come out because we had no plan coming in. On the social side, we need to address healthcare, healthcare for all. People who are most affected by this COVID crisis were the people who weren't healthy going in, and that's because our system is flawed. We need to provide training for healthcare workers to test and do contact tracing going forward, because this is not our last pandemic. On the environmental side, extremely important. We've seen a 25% decrease in pollution in New York City in the last 2 months. We need to build on that because that affects people's health as well going forward. But finally, foremost, and this I think addresses the question most directly, is my plan provides jobs, long-term jobs. I think the CARES Act was a Band-Aid. I think a lot of these programs are just to get people through the next little bit. But my program provides jobs, long-term jobs. As you mentioned, 36 to 40 million jobs were lost. Forbes predicts that over 42% of those jobs will never come back. So the federal government has to have a role in educating, training, and providing a federal economic backstop to people to work in the infrastructure industry and in renewable energy, because these are long-term, good-paying jobs that will support their families and also provide a benefit to our district and our country.
Thanks. So you mentioned the CARES Act there, which provided one-time payments of $1,200 to most people who are earning less than $99,000 a year. But as the unemployment rate climbs and we see cases continue to climb, there are plenty of members of Congress who are saying that these one-time payments just aren't enough. So one of these solutions, as Mr. Bowman sort of alluded to earlier, was the Automatic Boost to Communities Act from Congresswoman Tlaib, which would provide $2,000 a month, every month, so recurring payments to everyone over the age of 16. And you've seen politicians both in the House and the Senate proposing similar things, again, around that $2,000 a month number. So my question for you, Mr. Bowman, first, tell me about your support for programs like this. And since I know you've discussed a little bit about already, tell me about how long you think those payments should last.
So support it 100%, as I mentioned before, and they should last until we provide a federal jobs guarantee and get the 40 million people who have lost their jobs back to work. This is a perfect opportunity to rebuild our economic infrastructure in alignment with the demands that climate change is making upon us. This is the perfect opportunity for us to implement a Green New Deal through a federal jobs guarantee and get people back to work in areas like education, environmental justice, healthcare, and also infrastructure. In addition, I mentioned undocumented immigrants before and how they were kept out of the CARES Act and haven't received funding from the federal government. This is also in terms of if undocumented immigrants have children who are American citizens, their children aren't receiving support as well. So that's something we fought for. That's something we will continue to fight for. And that's something that should be part of any package that is proposed at the federal level.
Thank you. Mr. Fink, $2,000 a month recurring payments. What do you think?
You know, Jay, I think that one of the most important roles of the federal government is to keep our people safe. And so I can't tell you how long we need to provide payments like the CARES Act or $2,000. I think we need to figure out when we can safely get people back to work, get back to jobs that are still there. Until such time as we can do that safely, I think the role of the federal government is to provide a bridge, an economic bridge to those people so they can be safe. I'm not going to, like the Trump administration, force people back just so the economy could look good and he can get reelected. That's not my goal. My goal is to limit the amount of deaths, limit the amount of health crisis that we have in this country. So if we need to carry those $2,000 a month things through the end of the year, so be it. Their health and welfare is first. But again, I keep going back to, we need to be prepared to provide something more than a Band-Aid, long-term job training, education, and federal guarantee.
Thank you. Lastly, Mr. Ravello, what do you think?
Well, I'm the only one that has took Andrew Yang's freedom dividend. I have it on my platform as part of universal basic income. As part of my platform. But in the meantime, and it's let's study it, let's see how it applies. But it doesn't apply. It applies now more than ever. And I was the one that called for the $1,200 you saw. It did not last a minute. People will use that money. I mean, on groceries and probably pay some of the rent. It went right away. And I know plenty of my friends that went through that money quickly. I was hoping that they would guaranteed the 2,000 for at least a year. I know that we will be way on the other side of this pandemic, and I'm hoping that they include an infrastructure bill that I've been calling for the longest, guaranteeing good jobs and fixing our infrastructure here. I'm sorry, in this district that is in much need. Our bridges and roads are crumbling, and our water system, every time they do a new construction in Yonkers, they need to fix the main because it's breaking. So I'm hoping that right along that, they pass an infrastructure bill to put our people back to work.
Thank you. So now that we've talked about paycheck recovery, let's talk about Washington's favorite subject of legislation like this, which is paying for it. So you've got polling from the Justice Collaborative Institute and Data for Progress shows that a majority of Americans, and actually majorities of voters of both parties, excuse me, support multiple ways for the federal government to pay for programs like this one. So for example, most people, again, including most Democrats and most Republicans, support imposing a wealth tax on ultra millionaires, ultra billionaires. There's also support for a program that would require the United States Treasury to issue $2 trillion worth of new currency so the mint the coin idea that would allow the federal government to pay for this. So I'll ask Mr. Fink first. What's your position on first imposing the wealth tax, and/or do you agree or disagree with the idea that the federal government should mint a coin to pay for programs like these?
Jay, thank you. Thank you for giving me a tax question, because I have a master's in tax law from NYU, and I practiced tax law for 7 years before I became a municipal advisor. So I've thought about this subject a lot, and I feel strongly that we have to have a more progressive tax system. Whether that includes a wealth tax or not, so be it. I think that the wealthy are willing and able to pay more than they currently pay. I also would change the capital gain structure. There's no reason that capital gains should be taxed at such a lower rate than earned income. So I would close that gap, if not make them the same. I think that people work very hard in this country, and if they're paying taxes at the same level as people who are paying on passive income, that's not fair. So have a more progressive tax system. I don't think we should just print more money. I think that that's going to add to the federal deficit that our children and grandchildren are going to have to pay back for decades to come. I don't want to put us in that hole. I think we can do it current pay as you go by providing a more progressive tax system. Because if you look back historically, our income tax rates are among the lowest they've been in the last 100 years. So let's get back to a level where the wealthy are able, willing, and have to pay more for their share.
Thanks. I understand your position about printing currency, but you did talk about wanting a more progressive tax system. Would this, the one-time ultra-millionaire, ultra-billionaire wealth tax, would that fit in with the framework you're talking about?
I mean, I'd be fine with that. There's no reason not to. I somewhat disagree with a wealth tax because to some extent that's double taxation. The people who have that wealth, who again, we're not going to lose a lot of sleep over, the people who have that kind of wealth have been taxed on it in the first place. So you've taxed them when they earned it, and now you're going to tax them because they have it. So as somebody with a tax background, that's a little unusual.
So I guess the idea behind it would be that because, as you said, our tax system is so regressive, a wealth tax would be sort of catching up the system to ways we think it should have been in the past. What's your response to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's the way you justify it, is that we've, for a number of years, probably back to the Reagan administration, we've had tax rates that have not been reflective of a progressive tax system. So this is just catching up.
Thanks. Mr. Ravello, same question to you. Sammy, you're on mute, my friend. Beautiful.
Like I was saying, I'm gonna agree with Chris. Not gonna argue with a former tax attorney. You know, as he so eloquently put it, you know, we had tax cuts, you know, during the Reagan years. We got 2 tax cuts during the Bush years. Plus, on top of that, we started 2 wars. And now we have the Trump taxes. You know, I think we need to repeal those Trump taxes. It's really hurt us, especially here, especially the people in Congressional District 16. The SALT tax has been highly unpopular in this district. And I believe that we need to create a new high earning tax bracket to tax billionaires, similar to the millionaires tax here in New York. And I also believe that we can increase the state tax on the super rich. These are 2 ways of leveling off the playing field. You know, it has to be more progressive, and we need to. I mean, I think our kids and grandkids are already going to pay the money that we're spending right now. We need to start reversing that before, you know, we start paying the price big time.
Thanks very much, Mr. Bowman. Lastly.
Yes, I support the wealth tax, the ultra millionaire tax, and the ultra wealthy tax. Also support taxing Wall Street speculation at 2%, and closing the loophole so so corporations like Amazon pay federal taxes and pay their fair share. What you mentioned about the mint, I forgot how you referred to it. Something I'm not too familiar with. I have to do more research there. But in terms of how to pay for the programs that we are fighting for, support a wealth tax, support Wall Street speculation at 2%, and support large corporations paying their fair share of taxes, as well as taxing inheritance at a lower threshold as well.
Thank you. So at the top, we talked a little bit about the general concept of defunding police. And now I want to ask about a specific proposal related to sort of this idea of reimagining public safety. So you have Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who recently introduced a resolution, the People's Justice Guarantee, it's called. It includes a plan for creating first responder agencies to respond to police calls that don't require armed police intervention. For example, substance use, mental health crises, things of that sort. So for example, you'd have you would call 911, but instead of getting police out to something, you get social workers, other trained professionals who are able to use their expertise to respond. So my question for you, Mr. Ravello, first is, would you support the provision of significant federal funding to support local programs like these, to shift some of the first responder responsibilities from, again, what we might call traditional law enforcement to healthcare professionals and social workers?
Yes, and I said it when I was a police officer. And you said in the beginning that I retired in 2018. I actually retired last year, so I'm very familiar with what they do. And I've said it all along. And as a special operations lieutenant, I remember writing a letter to the commissioner saying that our police officers are responding to jobs that they weren't prepared to respond to. And sometimes we were responding to jobs on the fly. Obviously everything in the society was give it to the police, give it to the police, give it to the police. I totally agree. You have two young police officers, 24 years old, 22 years old, just out of college, responding to a mental health job that they're not ready to respond. And then that's when things escalate. Not necessarily any fault of the police officer, not necessarily anybody that the fault of the mental health patient. It's just that we are putting two things together that weren't ready to meet each other. So I totally 100% agree. Certain things, cops, we're better off having other people respond, other professionals other than police officers.
Thank you. You had talked at the top, though, when we talked about defunding policing, you had said that that's not something you support. And I understand that perspective. And also in the answer you just gave, you talked about how over time we've shifted more and more responsibility to the police.
I know why, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just like it's probably safe to say that with the shifting of more responsibilities to them has also been more funding to them.
Correct.
What is it that makes you support programs like this, but makes you reluctant to take funding away from the police in order to make sure those are a reality?
No. The defund the police means that you're pretty much saying we're going to take we defund the police, meaning we're going to get rid of the police department, and and everybody knows that's true. Jamal Bowman knows that's true. He keeps peddling that. When you assign school safety agents and now make them part of the police department, that's part of the taking programs away. You have school safety agents now inside schools. That should have not been done to begin with. That money, give these school safety agents, make them more counselors, make them more people that they can deal with our youth, and not give them police uniforms. Some people agree. These are things that we can do differently. I know why people give all the responsibility to police officers. They can call 911 and the police can respond quickly to a call because they're in service, but not really trained to deal with half of the jobs that they go to, and that's what I mean. But there is a role for police, and let's just say it, that we have a need to keep our police officers. They need to protect our citizens, but at the same time, we're giving them too much we give them too much responsibility. Let's take some of these responsibilities away, and let's create programs that are going to benefit our kids and the people in need.
Thanks. I'll ask the same question of you, Mr. Bowman.
Yes, support Congresswoman Presley's People's Justice Bill very strongly. We borrowed much of her bill to write our our criminal justice platform, and the reason why I support it is because it's rooted in restorative justice, and it's rooted in building community, and it's rooted in healing. We called when Tatiana Jefferson was killed back about a year ago in Texas. We immediately called for more non-emergency responses to situations that don't require lethal force. When I opened my school, I made it a point not to engage with school safety agents when it came to discipline. I did not hire a guidance I did not hire a dean of students. I did not hire a assistant principal. We hired a guidance counselor. We hired a social worker to provide the mental health and social and emotional supports to our kids. And we've been celebrated as a school for our restorative justice. And my personal background, I'm also trained as a guidance counselor before becoming the principal as well. So, engage in the community, assemblies, town halls, and making sure there's civilian review and the people involved in healing the harm that was caused within the community is essential going forward.
Thank you. Mr. Fink, same question.
Often the best proposals are the most simple proposals. And this one I could back 110% for the following reasons. I firmly believe that you put the best person in place to do the job well. As I mentioned earlier, I was a tax attorney, went to law school like every other lawyer, but I chose to focus on tax law. And when I became a tax lawyer, I'd get calls from relatives and friends and say, "You're a lawyer. Can you answer this criminal law question? Or can you answer this question about wills and estates?" I'm not prepared to do so. That's not my specialty. Same way that you wouldn't ask a tax law question of a criminal defense lawyer. In this case, you're talking about putting the right people with the right training in place to handle every situation. A, it would save money because you'd have no inefficiency. And B, it gets back to the point we talked about earlier, which is demilitarization of the police force and finding the best people for the job who are the best equipped, the best trained. And, there's no individual who can react at top efficiency to every single activity that the police have to cover, whether that be mental illness, drugs, family disputes. So to have the right person respond to each request or each necessary altercation, I think is a genius proposal.
Thank you. The last question I want to ask each of you is sort of at the intersection of the COVID-19 crisis and healthcare in this country. So you've had Senator Bernie Sanders introduce a bill called the Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act. What this bill would do is empower Medicare to cover all healthcare costs for people who are uninsured, as well as out-of-pocket expenses for folks who do have insurance, and that includes prescription drugs, until a vaccine for COVID-19 is available. And you've got polling, again, from the Justice Collaborative Institute and Data for Progress, showing that about 2/3 of Americans support this kind of bill, where the federal government is responsible for healthcare costs sort of in this unprecedented time. So my question, as a member of the House, would you support this bill? And I'll ask Mr. Bowman first.
Yes, absolutely. We've been running from the very beginning on Medicare for all. We believe healthcare is a human right, and healthcare costs should be single payer. They should be free at the point of delivery. There should be no co-pays, and they should include dental, optical, long-term care for our seniors, and mental health supports and everything in between. So this is something we definitely support. It's good to see that many who were on the fence regarding Medicare for All are coming off the fence and being more supportive since this pandemic has hit us all. But yes, I support that bill by Senator Sanders, who endorsed our campaign, which is awesome that happened.
Thank you. Mr. Fink, same question. What do you think about this bill?
I am very much in support of this bill. I too believe that healthcare is a fundamental human right that the government has to provide for their citizens, especially during the COVID crisis. Any costs for testing, for preventative health, for prescription drugs, for follow-up treatment, and obviously for treatment, should be covered by the federal government, because in part the federal government lack of response was responsible for what happened to our citizenry. People should not go bankrupt because of an unexpected healthcare bill, and we're seeing that all over the place. Whether it be because of prescription drug prices that are through the roof, especially compared to other countries, or just preventative or long-term healthcare. I think we also need to, and the COVID crisis really brought this to light, we need to separate healthcare coverage from employment. I think COBRA is a great program, but who's going to be able to pay premiums if they lost their job? So we need to separate that and make sure that people are covered at all times, regardless of whether they're working or not. Minorities were hit extremely hard during this crisis, and I think this is something we need to focus on and make sure that there is a safety net for all individuals in our country.
I want to make sure I understand. So when you talk about the need to divorce healthcare from employment, does that mean you're a supporter of Medicare for all, or do you favor some kind of public option, something in between?
I do favor a public option, but everyone needs to be covered.
Thank you. Mr. Ravello.
I agree with both Chris and Jamal. Healthcare is a right. The richest country in the world, and we cannot cover all our citizens. It's a shame. It's shameful, and you know that needs to end. If I had my choice, obviously I would start with a single payer, but we're not there right now, and we got forces that are not there. I favor right now a public option. But right now, I support Bernie Sanders' bill. I think that we should all be covered, especially with the lack of response by the federal government. Some of this was brought upon their fault, so we should all be covered. So I support that bill.
Thanks very much. That's all the questions I've got for each of you. I'd like to give each of you a minute just to deliver a brief closing statement as this election comes up. Mr. Fink, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Jay. Here in our district, you finally have a choice between four great individuals, three of whom are here tonight. And I think it's a good choice. On the one hand, you have a career politician who's represented us for 32 years. And he's focused a lot on international issues, but he's also had 32 years to get things done. And he hasn't gotten them done, in my view. On the other hand, you can pick a person who has very progressive ideas, but maybe too progressive for our district, and maybe not the experience to get them done. Or finally, you can pick me. I have both the experience and the plan. I mean, if you look at my website, I have plans on how we're going to come out of this crisis, how we're going to address social issues, how we're going to address economic issues and environmental issues. So if you want someone with experience and a plan, I would urge you to vote for Chris Fink.
Thanks very much. Mr. Ravello.
Election, you can continue with business as usual, or you can elect the politics of division. Both of these approaches have our government in Washington paralyzed. Or you can elect a leader that will lead from the front with a vision that together we can get things done. I hope to be that choice. Hay que tomar una decisión en estas elecciones. Puedes continuar con los negocios como siempre o puedes elegir la política de división. Ambos enfoques tienen nuestro gobierno paralizado. O puedes elegir un líder que tenga una visión para el futuro. Espero ser esa elección. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Lastly, Mr. Bowman.
Yes, thank you so much for putting this forum together. I've had the pleasure over the last 20 years of serving my community as a teacher, guidance counselor, and middle school principal, and I look forward to continuing that service as a member of Congress. We've been fortunate enough to be endorsed by over 60 individuals and grassroots organizations, including the Jewish Vote, the Working Families Party, the Justice Democrats, Make the Road Action, and many others. And just recently, we've been endorsed by former presidential candidates, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Bernie Sanders, and even Marianne Williamson. So we're very excited about the local and national support, and we look forward to bringing home a victory in 6 days after we continue to grind towards a win.
Thank you. Folks, this concludes our candidate forum for New York's 16th Congressional District Democratic primary. And as Mr. Bowman alluded to, primary election day is Tuesday, June 23rd, in a week. If you are voting by mail, please note that the deadline for the postmarked return of absentee ballots is June 23rd, which means you got to drop them in the mail on that day. Early voting started on June 13th and will take place until June 21st. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the governor has ordered all voters who are eligible to vote to do so by absentee. Thank you again to our candidates, Mr. Bowman, Mr. Fink, and Mr. Ravello, and to everybody who joined us to watch today. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.